For more on this, we are now joined by Phelisa Nkomo, who's a development economist, policy and advisor expert. A very good evening to you, Phelisa. Thanks very much for your time. You've gone through the reports in the time, of course, you had in between doing what you told me you were doing today. Your impressions overall?
I mean, firstly, I think just want to say that I think it was great for South Africa to commission this report because fundamentally, as an African country, it's politically, it would have been actually a missed opportunity not to tackle, inequality issues. I think that's the first thing. I think the second one is that this report is actually quite comprehensive. And I would really, really hope that policymakers, particularly parliamentarians, are going to pay attention to, because it raises a number of things. For instance, amongst the first issue that it raises is that between 2004, we've seen an increase of wealth of the population of 1% to about 48%, meaning that if the wealth share, the global wealth share has actually increased for only 1%, it means that the bottom 1% is actually picking up scramble or is scrambling, right? So that's the first thing. And then the other one, it actually maps out quite interestingly the issues around inter-country inequality issues. It highlights policy gaps that actually lead into inequality. Also, the other issue which I think is quite useful, and the timing for South Africa to commission this report, it highlights the global rules that actually re-entrenches inequality, which is there's an additional burden that the country had to carry. Amongst those, it highlights the global rules of trade and engagement and how countries in middle-income countries, developing countries, poorer countries are compelled to comply to certain global rules that may not be working for them. We know, for instance, we saw them during the COVID, how the World Trade Organization at the time, where it was really meant to be an institution that looks at building an equitable society or contributing to an equitable society through access to healthcare. And there was just no consensus for African countries in particular. South Africa was ready to manufacture vaccines. South Africa was ready to manufacture certain goods. We also know, for instance, how within the agricultural sector, there are certain rules that really impedes or inhibits African countries to actually trade with each other, let alone just on manufacturing goods. So I really like the intersectionality between macroeconomic planning, industrial policy, global financial architecture, right? But also fundamentally, then obviously still lending it home to the fact that governments must actually focus on designing domestic policies that looks at, firstly, income inequality, that looks at issues around housing, access to education, and healthcare. So it's really, really a comprehensive report. And I think it's really a strong consensus document unto which countries leading to G20 and even post-G20 could really find a common ground on what are the things that they need to do and how they actually need to correct. But also fundamentally, at a national level, how they allocate resources to particularly deal with issues of inequality at a country level and regional level.
But then, we've always known that we do have domestically the policy gaps, right? We've always known as well that the global rules don't necessarily work for us. What then becomes the usefulness of this report, especially for a forum like G20, where one nation can say nay and everything collapses and you suddenly don't have a declaration and there's very little, if anything, that you can do. Am I being way too simplistic here?
No, you're absolutely correct. In fact, I think for me, there's something that South Africa really needs to champion within G20 and fundamentally make it sure that the output of the G20 truly reflects the interests of South Africans, of Africans, and people of Global South. Yes, it's true that G20 is really not a platform a global platform that actually makes decisions. I mean, mainly one of the multilateral institutions that makes decisions would be, for instance, United Nations. However, it's a critical forum that actually facilitates engagement, but also facilitates that countries can find common ground. So, what then the South African government needs to do through this report is to truly use it to leverage, to achieve both domestically, but also to advocate and have conversations with other governments on the things that needs to be done at a multilateral level to make it sure that all these other global policy framework that actually increases inequality within a global south are actually dealt with. For instance, amongst those is the international financial architecture, right? Its design. One of those is the IMF, for instance, is the World Bank, and how it forces certain types of macroeconomic policy interventions, which actually derails growth within the countries. So, in essence, it's really a good document, and it's a good document for policymakers globally, but at the same time, it's a document that they really, really need to make it sure that it gets integrated into either declarations where working groups are able to have declarations, or in statements, right? And I think how it helps though is the fact that already it outlines the problem statement, but also it outlines the solution.
Now,
So they really, and I think, and more often than not, in some of these global conversations, the problem statement is always there, and actually solutions are not. I think this report actually it says here are the solutions. But let's come into
now, I want to talk about one of the key recommendations of this report. They are saying that there should be an international panel on inequality should be established along the lines of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is regarded as a leading authority on climate science. But then we have seen that in spite of such of the establishment of such panels as the one on climate change, you will still have your United States of America, for example, really dismissing those things. And this becomes an important conversation point, especially because that's where the G20 is going. They are going to take over the presidency of the G20 in the next month or so.
Actually, this is an important point. I think this could be one of the critical legacies for South Africa. Amongst the key things that South Africa probably needs to really push for within the G20 is that decisions should not be taken through consensus. It must be taken through sufficient consensus. If, for instance, 9 to 11 countries are in agreement on a particular issue, actually that decision should stand. Because the point exactly you're making, that you have one country who would really stand against a particular decision. Because then what that it does, by the way, it delegitimizes the role of this important multilateral forum. And if countries do not protect it by making sure that it has good political standing, but also too, it increases public trust, because if they don't, if if they don't defend it, the risk they have is that G20 is just going to move into different countries and people will see it as a waste of resources. On the international panel, I think that's an excellent proposal. In fact, with all the complexities of these committees, but we've seen how within the climate change, the decision making has not only been complex, but at least we've seen some progress. I mean, in fact, two major decisions that have been taken in the previous COP. Firstly, was the recognition of carbon credits. Now, I think the other one was an increase of financing, which has been one of the issues that has long been coming. But also fundamentally, the value about this international forum is that you then take an issue that affects Mohammad Lamini, Ngiyani, and Mdantsane to be right in the center of a global conversation. That it's not an issue that only gets discussed by Global South, in that, in fact, you bring in Global North that is well resourced on the back of the resources that are extracted from Global South and developing countries. So I think for me, if South Africa can pursue the establishment of that panel, that would be actually one of the best legacy projects. But part of it as well, hand it over with this report, and that panel should then monitor both national instruments that get used to deal with inequality, but also at the same time, global instruments. But fundamentally, tackle these other global rules that actually really entrenches wealth inequality, asset inequality, and social rights inequality in the world.
Indeed, Professor Stiglitz and his panel reckon that it would be a permanent legacy of South Africa's G20 presidency if that panel was indeed to be established. Phelisa Nkomo, development economist, policy and advisor expert.